Before we start, turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and click the like button to support the channel. If you like scary stories, subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any news. Let's get started. I was never afraid to drive at night. For me, those quiet hours on the road were almost therapeutic. Just the sound of the engine, the asphalt stretching out ahead, and a playlist playing softly. It was my way of disconnecting from the world. But that night, something changed. He was returning home after a long day at work, passing through a road he knew well. The sky was moonless, and the car's headlights seemed to be the only thing to illuminate that endless emptiness. Still, I was calm. It was just another ordinary night. It was then that I noticed something strange. For a brief moment, as my eyes swept over the rearview mirror, I had the impression that something was moving behind me. A shadow. There was nothing there, just the empty seats. I shook my head and laughed at myself. It was fatigue talking. I kept driving. The radio was badly tuned to a song I didn't recognize, but I kept the sound on, just to break the silence. Until suddenly, I felt a slight vibration on the floor of the car, almost imperceptible. At first, I thought it was just the rough road, but then came the sound, a scratch, weak but insistent, as if long nails were scraping the bottom of the car. I stopped breathing for a moment. I forced myself to look straight ahead, my hands grabbing the steering wheel. Maybe it was a branch stuck in the chassis. That made sense. Yes, a branch. I sped up a little, trying to ignore the discomfort that was growing in my chest. But deep down, something didn't feel right. After that strange scratching sound, I drove on. My heart was still racing, but I tried to convince myself that it was nothing. Maybe a branch stuck in the bottom of the car or something hitting the bodywork. It was a country road after all. Things like that happened all the time. But something inside me wouldn't settle down. I looked at the rearview mirror again, even though I knew I shouldn't. There were only the empty seats behind me, and the darkness swallowing what the headlights could not reach. I sighed and tried to concentrate on the road. I remembered that I had left work later than usual. The night was especially cold, and heavy clouds obscured any starlight. The radio kept playing faintly a song that I didn't recognize, a somewhat distorted sound, which only contributed to the feeling of discomfort. For a moment, I thought about stopping and checking if there was really something stuck in the underside of the car. But the idea of going out on such a deserted road seemed to me wrong. "There's nothing there," I said out loud, trying to convince myself. My fingers tightened on the steering wheel, and I accelerated a little more. But the road looked different that night. I've always made this way home, but something seemed emptier, stranger. It was as if the world had stopped, leaving only me and that weird sound in the distance. The feeling that something was wrong began to grow. The road seemed endless, a tunnel of darkness that was only interrupted by the dim light of the headlights. The world around him had turned into an absolute void, where the only sound was the constant roar of the engine and the faint hiss of the radio. The isolation was palpable, as if that road were a place apart, disconnected from the rest of the world. To the right and left, tall trees formed elongated shadows that seemed to move in the wind. During the day, that route was almost comforting, a quiet and familiar passage. But at night, everything changed. The trees seemed silent observers, and the road itself had an unsettling atmosphere. I squeezed the steering wheel tightly. My eyes alternated between the asphalt ahead and the rearview mirror, where the empty seats still gave me back a strange feeling of discomfort. Outside, everything was so quiet that it seemed wrong. There were no signs of life, not even the distant sound of a cricket or some animal crossing the road. The temperature seemed to have dropped suddenly, and a shiver ran down my spine. I looked at the clock on the dashboard. It was 37 past midnight. There was still almost half an hour to get home. That's when I noticed something peculiar. A light fog began to form, hovering close to the ground. It was not common in that stretch, especially on a dry night like that. The fog moved slowly, as if it was being pushed by something invisible. The sight made me restless, but not enough to stop the car. Suddenly, the radio sizzled louder and cut the music for a few seconds. Instead, I heard a distorted noise, like a slurred but incomprehensible voice. I was tense. My heart started beating faster. I slowed down, trying to adjust the volume, but the sound returned to normal as if nothing had happened. The road returned to silence, but that feeling of discomfort did not leave me. After that strange hiss on the radio, my attention was divided between the road and the dashboard. Something inside me said that I should ignore what happened, that it was probably just interference. But the feeling persisted, as if an invisible presence had just passed by, leaving a mark in the air. My eyes were fixed on the asphalt ahead, but a shadow moved across the corner of my field of vision. It was fast, almost imperceptible, but enough to make me press the steering wheel. I looked at the mirrors again, but only saw the usual emptiness. I took a deep breath, trying to push away the discomfort. The road was completely deserted, no cars were coming behind, and streetlights were non-existent on that stretch. The only sound was the car's engine and the slight hum of vibration on the pedals. It was then that I heard it again, a dry, popping sound coming from the back of the car. I instinctively looked into the rearview mirror, as if I expected to see something there, but all I found was darkness. "Calm down, it's just the road," I muttered to myself. It must be the uneven floor. But the sound came back, this time clearer, a scratch that seemed to come from under the car. Slow, almost intentional. It was as if something was dragging across the chassis. My mind started to fire possibilities. A stuck branch? Any animal? But none of these ideas explained the sound. It was rhythmic, as if following the movement of the wheels. I slowed down, thinking about stopping to check, but something inside me was telling me to keep going. The air inside the car felt heavier, and my instincts screamed not to get out. When I looked again in the rearview mirror, I swear I saw something different. For a split second, I had the impression that something was in the back seats, a shadow or an indistinct shape. I turned my head quickly to look straight at it, but of course there was nothing there. My breathing was panting, and the discomfort grew. I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was trying to get close to me. The sound ceased as suddenly as it had begun. For a moment, everything seemed normal again. The engine running smoothly. The road ahead plunged into darkness. I tried to convince myself that it had been just my imagination, amplified by fatigue. But my body didn't believe it. My heart was still beating fast, and my hands were firmly gripping the wheel. It was then that I saw it. In the middle of the road, a few meters away, something seemed to move. At first glance, it looked like an animal, small, perhaps a dog or a coyote. I slowed down, trying to figure out what it was, but when the headlights illuminated it, I realized it wasn't any animal I'd ever seen before. It was short, with a clumsy, contorted shape, as if its limbs weren't in the right place. Her skin looked pale and shiny in the light, almost translucent. He didn't move like an animal. His movements were slow, calculated, as if he knew I was watching. I was paralyzed for a moment. My first impulse was to brake completely, but something told me that I shouldn't stop. Instead, I sped up slightly, waiting for the thing to move out of my way. But she didn't leave. The animal stopped right in the middle of the road and turned its head in my direction. It had no visible eyes, just two deep shadows where the eyes should be. It was as if he was watching me, studying myself. I stepped on the accelerator hard. The car moved forward, and at the last second, the thing moving out of the way with a motion that seemed unnaturally fast. The impact never came. There was no sound of anything being hit, nor a thud on the bodywork. I looked in the rearview mirror, but the road behind me was empty. A wave of relief mixed with confusion hit me. I could have sworn I had seen something. I could have sworn I wasn't imagining it. But deep down I knew that this was just the beginning. My heart was still pounding in my chest as I tried to put what had just happened behind me. But no matter how much he accelerated, the feeling that something was wrong did not disappear. I continued driving for a few more minutes, trying to focus only on the asphalt. The road seemed narrower now, as if the world around me was closing in. It was then that I saw the lights flashing ahead. Emergency flares. I stepped on the brakes, slowing down. A pair of cones reflected the light from my headlights, marking a makeshift block. There was no one around, just a handwritten sign on an old wooden sign. Left turn. I looked at the GPS, but the signal had disappeared a few miles ago. A detour? I had never seen anything like it before. The main road was always quiet, with no need for route changes. The most logical thing would be to turn around and find another way, but at that point, fatigue was already heavy. I just wanted to get home. I sighed and turned the steering wheel to follow the detour. As soon as I got on the new road, the difference was evident. The well-maintained asphalt gave way to a narrow, bumpy track, flanked by dense trees that blocked almost all the light from the headlights. It was like entering a living tunnel. I accelerated slightly, trying to ignore the feeling that I was being watched. The forest seemed closer than ever, with curved branches that formed strange and unsettling silhouettes. That's when I noticed something curious. The temperature inside the car seemed to be dropping again, despite the heater being on. The feeling of cold was accompanied by a slight vibration in the floor of the car, something familiar, but now more intense. Once again, the radio sizzled, and a static took over. But this time, something else emerged from the sound. A low, distorted voice seemed to whisper in the background. I turned off the radio immediately, my fingers quivering on the button. The silence returned, but it was worse. It was an oppressive, almost suffocating silence. I looked in the rearview mirror, once again feeling that restlessness. And it was then that I saw it. A shadow crossed the road behind me, too big and too fast to be an animal. I pressed the steering wheel and accelerated. I didn't know what was happening, but one thing was certain. That deviation was not there by chance. As he accelerated, the detour seemed to extend forever, like an endless maze. The road, increasingly uneven, made the car sway. The trees around were so close together that sometimes the branches seemed to want to scrape against the bodywork. It was then that I heard it again. At first it sounded muffled, almost indistinct, but as the car progressed, it became sharper, a scratch, like long fingernails scraping against the underside of the vehicle. I put the brakes on the brakes, almost stopping, but the memory of that internal warning, that feeling that something was telling me not to stop, kept me going. The sound became louder, more insistent. Now it seemed that it came from all sides, from the floor, from the doors, from the ceiling. At every moment, I had the impression that something was trying to get into the car. I looked again at the mirrors, trying to see what could be causing it, but there was nothing but darkness. My eyes quickly swept over the back seats, and air was trapped in my throat. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something there, an indistinct shape, as if the shadow had gained weight and settled in the back seats. I blinked and looked again, but of course there was nothing. "You're imagining things," I muttered, trying to stay calm. But the sound persisted. It was then that something different happened. The dashboard of the car flickered for a moment, as if the power had been cut off, and quickly turned back. The radio, even turned off, emitted a static sound, and the lights inside turned on and off in a short click. And then I listened. A blow, tall, direct, as if something or someone had knocked the passenger door. My breathing stopped. I forced myself not to look, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. But peripheral vision betrayed me. A shadow seemed to be there, outside, gliding along the glass. I accelerated as much as the car allowed. The engine roared loudly, and the sound of scratches seemed to follow me, as if it were glued to the car. Every second seemed like an eternity, and the sound kept going, as if no matter how fast I went, it was with me. It was then that the road began to change. The trees began to open up, revealing an empty field ahead. For a moment I thought I was free, but the sound continued. And worse, now it came from within. The feeling of something inside the car was enough to make my stomach turn. The sound, which had previously seemed to come from outside, now seemed to be in the confined space around me. My mind was racing, trying to find a logical explanation. It was not possible. I had locked the doors as soon as I got in the car. No one could be there. It was at that moment that the dashboard flashed again, but this time it did not return to normal. All the lights on the dashboard went out at once, and the engine began to sputter. The car lost power quickly, and I was forced to pull over. The silence returned, but it was a heavy, suffocating silence. I took my cell phone from the passenger seat and looked at the screen, but of course there was no signal. Not even the GPS seemed to work. Great. All that was missing, I mumbled, trying to hide the growing panic. I looked around, at the empty field and the distant trees. The headlights still illuminated a few meters ahead, revealing only the oppressive emptiness of the road. I took a deep breath and, against my best judgment, turned off the engine and pulled the door handle. The air outside was cold, much colder than it should have been for that time of year. Every step I took around the car seemed to echo on the deserted road. I bent down to look under the chassis, looking for anything that could explain the sounds I heard. A stuck branch, a loose piece of metal. But there was nothing. The silence was broken by another sound. A snap, tall and dry, coming from the field next door. I stood up quickly, my eyes trying to see through the darkness. But there was nothing there, at least not in sight. Another snap, closer now. It was like the sound of branches breaking under something heavy. My breath became short, and every instinct screamed for me to get back in the car. When I turned to the driver's door, I stopped in the middle of the movement. On the window glass, a mark was visible, a handprint. It wasn't big, but the fingers were long and thin, and whatever had left that mark seemed to have made an effort to get in. Without thinking twice, I ran into the car and slammed the door hard. I turned the key in the ignition, praying for the engine to start, and after an agonizing moment, it came back to life. I accelerated without looking back, but the sound of the branches breaking continued, now accompanied by a new sensation, that I was being followed. As he accelerated, the feeling of being watched grew even stronger. It was almost tangible, as if a pair of invisible eyes were fixed on me, following my every movement. I looked in the rearview mirror, even though I knew I didn't really want to see what might be there. At first I only saw the empty road, illuminated by the rear lights. But then a shadow moved at the edge of the light, something fast, but dense, as if it had weight. My whole body stiffened, and my fingers tightened on the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The sound I had heard before, the cracking of branches breaking, now seemed more constant, almost like footsteps following the car in the distance. "That's not happening," I muttered, trying to convince myself that it was fatigue, my mind playing tricks. But a part of me knew it was real. That's when the sound changed. A dull knock echoed down the side of the car, as if something had jumped and collided with the bodywork. My eyes instinctively turned to the passenger window, but all I saw was a blur, something that moved too fast to identify. I accelerated even more. The car roared against the rough road, rattling at every pothole. But it didn't matter how far I went, the feeling persisted. And then came the worst. Out of nowhere, the interior rearview window fogged up, as if someone had just taken a deep breath on it. My heart stopped for a second. That was impossible. All the windows were closed, and I was alone. Or it wasn't. I tried to ignore it, stared at the road ahead, and kept speeding up. But suddenly, something caught my eye out of the corner of my eye. A dark shape seemed to be moving in the back seat, a shadow that shouldn't be there. My breathing was out of control. The seconds seemed to drag on. Slowly, I turned my head to look in the rearview mirror. It was then that I saw it. It was not a complete figure but an outline, an indistinct silhouette, like a black spot with contorted ends. It seemed to pulsate as if it was trying to solidify. Before I could process what I was seeing, a loud and sudden sound cut through the silence. A thud, as if something had fallen on the roof of the car. My mind went into survival mode. Without thinking, I sped up as fast as I could, trying to ignore the sounds, the shadows, and the certainty that something was with me, and trying to get in. The blow to the roof was so strong that it made the car sway. For a second, I thought the vehicle was going to go off the road. My heart was racing, and the sound, that dull thud, still echoed in my ears. I knew I couldn't stop. I couldn't even look up. Something was there, and the last thing I wanted was to face anything. The sound has changed. Now they were scratches, like long nails sliding across the bodywork, first on the roof, then on the sides. They were slow and methodical movements, as if it was deliberately trying to terrify me. This isn't happening. This isn't happening, I repeated to myself as my eyes remained fixed on the road. But the scratches continued, higher and higher, as if it was approaching me, moving towards the windshield. Suddenly, the dashboard light flashed again, but this time it went out completely. The darkness inside the car was absolute, broken only by the headlights illuminating the road ahead. But then something blocked the light. A dark shape slid through the front window, thick and misshapen, obscuring the view of the road. It was neither human nor animal. It was something I couldn't describe, something that didn't make sense. My hands trembled on the steering wheel. I tried to see past the figure, but it moved slowly, scraping the glass with something that looked like claws. The thing stopped right in the center of the windshield, as if it wanted me to see it. For an instant that seemed eternal, she stood still. And then he did the impossible. He tilted his head and began to observe me. My body froze. I couldn't look away, as if the thing was trapping me in some kind of trance. His eyes were only deep shadows, but they were full of intent. That's when the thing attacked. With a quick and violent movement, he hit the windshield hard. The glass cracked, but it didn't break completely. The sound was deafening, and the impact made the entire car shake. I instinctively stepped on the brakes. The car skidded, but it didn't stop. My only thought was to escape, to continue, to get out of there as soon as possible. The thing disappeared as suddenly as it appeared. I looked around frantically, but there was nothing, neither on the ceiling nor in the windows. But then I listened. A sound of heavy breathing. It didn't come from outside. It came from within. The sound of breathing was so close that it seemed to take up all the space inside the car. It was irregular, almost animalistic, but with a rhythm that suggested something deliberate, conscious. My hands trembled as I held the wheel, trying to keep the car on the road. My whole body screamed not to look, to stay focused ahead. But it was impossible to ignore the feeling that something was behind me. Slowly, my gaze went to the rearview mirror. I should have kept looking at the road. In the back seat there was something. Not a solid form, but a dense, almost pulsating shadow. It was as if darkness had taken shape, filling the space that was previously empty. The shadow seemed to move slowly, like living smoke, but then something emerged from it, a long, disproportionate arm, with thin fingers that ended in sharp claws. He stretched forward towards me. "No!" I shouted, accelerating the car like never before. The engine roared in protest, and the speedometer went up. But the thing did not retreat. The arm kept moving forward, scratching the back of the driver's seat. I could hear the fabric tearing, the threads being torn out as the thing got closer and closer. Without thinking, I turned the steering wheel sharply to the right, causing the car to skid in a sharp turn. The movement threw me against the door and almost knocked me out of control. But for a moment, the sound ceased. I quickly looked in the rearview mirror. The shadow had disappeared, but I knew I wasn't safe. Before I could breathe a sigh of relief, something hit the side of the car hard, almost throwing me off the track. The thing was outside now, keeping up with the car moving too fast to be natural. I accelerated again, the tires squealing against the uneven asphalt. Each hole seemed to be an additional obstacle between me and security. But for some reason it seemed to be letting me get away, as if he were playing with me. This is not real, I kept repeating to myself, trying to shake off the growing fear. But I could feel it. It was then that the thing struck again. A sound of impact came from the ceiling, and I felt the car sway. I looked up instinctively, and that's when I realized, no matter what I did, it wouldn't stop. With adrenaline taking over my body, I did the only one I thought could work. I squeezed the steering wheel tightly, my eyes fixed on the road ahead, and then I accelerated straight into the next corner, not caring what was coming. I didn't know if I could escape. I just knew I had to try. The corner appeared quickly, and the car almost skidded, but I managed to keep it on the track. The sound of the thing moving on the ceiling was still clear, scratches, knocks, as if it was holding on there. I was close to the limit, both from the car and from myself. The feeling that it was playing with me was unbearable. It was as if he was sure that I had nowhere to run, that it was only a matter of time before he caught up with me. But then something changed. In the midst of this madness, I noticed a faint light flickering in the distance. It was so subtle that it almost went unnoticed, but it was there, a kind of orange glow, pulsing like a torch or a distant fire. That didn't make sense. I was in the middle of nowhere, but the idea that there might be someone there, perhaps a house or a small village, gave me a spark of hope. I stepped even harder on the accelerator, directing the car towards the light. As I approached, something began to happen. The sound of the thing on the ceiling became more frantic, as if he knew I was trying to escape. The knocks got louder, and I could hear scratches coming down the windows. But strangely, at the same time, I began to feel a change in my own surroundings. The air inside the car became lighter, less oppressive. Even the intense cold I felt began to give way, as if the presence of that light was pushing it away. Suddenly, the beating stopped. For a brief moment, all was silent, except for the sound of the engine and the wind rushing through the windows. I looked in the rearview mirror, my heart racing, but I saw nothing. That's when I saw him. For a fraction of a second, a figure appeared reflected in the rear window. It was no longer a shapeless shadow. It was something that seemed almost human, but completely wrong. His face was partially hidden, as if covered by a mist, but what little I could see left me paralyzed. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes— there were no eyes, just dark holes that seemed to pull me in. I blinked, and he disappeared. I took a deep breath, trying to control the tremor in my hands. The light ahead was getting closer and closer, and I clung to the idea that whatever it was, it might be losing its strength. But deep down I knew that was still with me, just waiting for the right moment to strike again. The light was getting closer and closer, but something told me that I needed to get to it before it was too late. It was as if the very air around me was conspiring to slow me down. The car's engine, which until then responded well, began to choke, emitting noises that made me fear that it would stop for good. "Not now, please, not now," I mumbled, begging the car to resist. The silence that had been established moments before was broken by a new sound. It was subtle at first, an almost indistinguishable rustle, but it soon got louder, turning into a sound that made my skin crawl. It was as if dozens of voices were whispering at once, each one of them calling out to me. The sound came from all sides, seeping into the car, into my thoughts. I tried to ignore it, but the voices intensified, forming words that made no sense, a language that seemed old, but loaded with malice. "Stop. Don't run away." I squeezed the steering wheel so hard that my fingers started to hurt. My instinct screamed to continue, not to obey those voices. The light was there, so close, that I could almost feel it. But something was coming. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. The road ahead began to twist, as if it were no longer solid. The trees on either side seemed to lean inward, their branches intertwining above the car, forming a kind of tunnel. And then something crossed my path. It was fast but big, a huge shadow that seemed to occupy all the space in front of me. I tried to brake, but the car didn't respond. The pedal was stiff, as if something was locking it up. "No, no," I shouted, struggling to maintain control as the car hurtled straight into the darkness. As I crossed, the light ahead burst into brilliance. For a moment I was blinded, and a strange heat invaded the car, as if I had passed through an invisible barrier. The voices ceased. The sound of the engine returned to normal. I looked in the rearview mirror, but whatever was following me was gone. I took a deep breath, trying to process what had just happened. But before I could relax, I noticed something strange. The light I had attained, the one that seemed like my salvation, was not what I had hoped for. It was not a house, nor a village, but something much worse. The light that seemed my only hope now illuminated something completely unexpected. The car left the main road and stopped in a small field. In the center, a structure stood, precarious and surreal, a kind of makeshift tower, made of old wood and twisted metal, with several lamps dangling on exposed wires. It was from there that the pulsating light came, a mixture of orange and white that seemed more alive than electric. I turned off the engine, unable to decide whether to go straight ahead or turn around. The silence around me was absolute, but it didn't bring comfort. In fact, it was even more suffocating than before. Suddenly, the light flickered again, and a deep, reverberating sound echoed through the clearing. It was like a bell, but with a distorted tone, which seemed to vibrate inside my chest. Instinctively, I looked around, looking for any sign of movement. It was then that I saw it. Something was standing at the base of the structure, just in the shade of the flickering lamps. At first, it looked like just a silhouette, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized the details that the darkness hid. He was tall, very tall, with long, disproportionate arms that almost touched the ground. The skin, if it could be called that, seemed too stretched, translucent, and glowing slightly in the light. And the head, it didn't have a natural shape. It was elongated, with a total absence of eyes, nose, or mouth. But I knew I was looking at myself. My breath caught in my throat as the thing took a slow step towards me. There was no sound at all, not the snapping of branches, not the sound of feet touching the ground. It was as if that movement defied logic. Instinctively, I locked the car doors and pressed the button to start the engine again. But the car did not respond. The thing took another step, and this time a thin, disfigured hand rose up, pointing directly at the vehicle. At the same moment, the car's interior lights flashed violently, and the radio came back to life, emitting a deafening noise. But in the middle of the static, something else appeared, a voice, distorted but clear enough for me to understand. "You shouldn't have come." The intense heat took over the car, and the windshield glass began to crack. The thing was slowly approaching, as if it had all the time in the world. Desperate, I slammed the key into the ignition over and over again, until suddenly the engine came back to life with a roar. Without thinking, I stepped on the gas and threw the car forward, straight towards the creature. There was a dry impact, and the thing disappeared under the vehicle. The car shook violently, but I kept accelerating, trying to get out of there as quickly as possible. When I looked in the rearview mirror, the open field was gone, as well as the tower. There was only the road again, as if none of that had happened. But deep down I knew that wasn't over. I drove as fast as I could, without looking back. The road seemed endless, but eventually, the trees began to open up, revealing a familiar horizon. The first lights of the city appeared in the distance, bringing a brief and false sense of security. When I finally got home, I parked the car in the garage and turned off the engine. The absolute silence enveloped me, but it was not comforting. My hands were still shaking, and my body was wet with cold sweat. For a moment, I sat in the car, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Nothing made sense. But when my eyes passed through the rearview mirror, something made me freeze. On the rear window, there was still a mark, the same handprint with those long, disproportionate fingers. She was as sharp as before and looked fresh, as if she had just been left there. I swallowed, got out of the car in a hurry, and ran into the house. I locked the door behind me, slid to the floor, and stood there for a few minutes, trying to convince myself that I was safe. All was quiet. No sound coming from the street, no sign that there was anything out there. But the feeling that I wasn't alone persisted, creeping through my mind like a parasite. I walked slowly to the bedroom, my footsteps echoing through the silent house. It was then that I realized something that wasn't there before. On the living room table, where I used to leave my cell phone and keys, there was a folded piece of paper. He wasn't there when I left. With trembling fingers, I opened the note. The words, written in a tortuous and irregular handwriting, were simple, but they chilled my blood. "You can run, but you can never escape." I let go of the paper immediately, my heart racing. I went to the windows, pulled back the curtains, and checked every lock in the house, but nothing seemed wrong. And yet, the discomfort did not go away. Since that night, I have avoided driving at night. Something changed in me. Whenever I look in the rearview mirror, I feel like I can see something else there, a shadow, a movement, a reflection that isn't mine. I never got to explain what happened, but there's something you need to know. If you are alone on the road at night and hear a strange sound, please do not stop. Don't look back.